1935, a film set deep in the forests of Washington state. The Call of the Wild. Remote location, small crew, no studio oversight. 23-year-old Loretta Young, one of the most beautiful actresses of Hollywood's golden age, known as the industry's holy girl. A devout Catholic who had never kissed on screen before marriage, who attended church every Sunday and publicly declared her virginity. America adored her for this purity in an era when everything else was falling apart. And Clark Gable, 34-year-old king of Hollywood, America's most desired man, a married womanizer with a predator's reputation, who had never heard the word no and didn't need to. A man whispered about on every film set. He took the first night with every new co-star, and the studio covered up whatever happened after. Late one evening, after the crew had retired to their trailers, Gable invited Loretta to his to discuss tomorrow's scene, he said. She came alone, naive and trusting, raised to be obedient to men, especially men with power. The trailer door closed behind her. What happened that night, Loretta Young didn't speak about publicly for 60 years. When she finally did, she used a strange, passive phrase. He was available. Not, we had an affair. Not, we made love. He was available, as if it happened to her against her will, as if she was simply there and he took what he wanted. Her daughter, learning this story 31 years after her birth, told her mother directly to her face, "Mom, that's called rape." Loretta broke down crying and answered, "Don't say that. I didn't resist." Her daughter asked, "Could you? You were alone in a trailer with the most powerful man in Hollywood, and you thought refusing would kill your career." 3 months after that night, Loretta realized she was pregnant by the most famous actor in Hollywood, in an era when pregnancy outside marriage meant career death and social annihilation. She disappeared from Hollywood under the pretense of illness, gave birth in a secret clinic, and placed her newborn daughter in an orphanage, registering her as Mother Unknown. Then, when Catholic guilt became unbearable, she adopted her own child and pretended to the entire world that she had rescued an orphan. Clark Gable knew about the child and never once in his entire life acknowledged his daughter, never spoke to her, never gave her a cent. Loretta Young knew the truth and lied every single day for 31 years, looking her daughter in the eyes and calling her adopted. And their daughter, Judy Lewis, grew up with huge protruding ears, an exact genetic copy of Gable's ears, and spent her whole life not understanding why her mother obsessively forced her to wear hats, hide her hair, and at age 7 had her undergo plastic surgery on her ears without explanation. This is a story about how Hollywood protects rapists because they make money. This is a story about how religion turns victims into accomplices, making them believe they sinned rather than suffered. This is a story about how lies told for career and reputation destroy lives across 3 generations and create trauma that passes like a genetic curse. What if I told you that Loretta Young defended Clark Gable until her dying day and called rape a romance? That she forced her own daughter to keep the secret even when the truth could have freed them both? That she chose the legend of a dead rapist over the happiness of her living child? Friends, this story is about the darkest and dirtiest secret of Hollywood's golden age, about a system that turned rape into romances and made women grateful for it, about how studios covered up sexual crimes because stars were worth millions and actresses were disposable, about how religion taught women that if something was done to your body, you're to blame, about how children pay for their parents' sins and cowardice. YouTube doesn't like when we tell these stories because they destroy legends and question icons. The algorithm suppresses content that calls kings rapists. Only your support allows us to keep speaking truth, no matter how uncomfortable. Right now, hit subscribe and like this video. It's a signal to YouTube that you're ready to hear what others are afraid to say. It's your vote for truth over comfortable lies. Done? Excellent. We begin. Loretta before Nenye, the holy girl built to fall. To understand what happened in that trailer and why Loretta Young defended her rapist for life, you need to understand who she was and how Hollywood created the perfect victim. Born in 1913 as Gretchen Young into a devout Catholic family where every Sunday began with Mass and every evening ended with prayer. Her mother brought her to Hollywood at age 4, and by 14, Gretchen was already appearing in major studio films under the stage name Loretta Young. But MGM didn't just create an actress Nenye. They created a brand, an image, a fantasy for Depression-era America. Loretta Young became known as Hollywood's holy girl, Nenye, the only actress who publicly declared she had never kissed before marriage, didn't drink alcohol, didn't smoke cigarettes, and remained a virgin until her wedding. In an era when everything was collapsing, Nenye the economy, morality, hope, Nenye Loretta was a symbol of what remained uncorrupted. America clung to this image desperately, as proof that purity still existed somewhere in this rotting world. The studio exploited this mercilessly, building every interview, every photo shoot, every public appearance around this virginal holiness. Loretta in a white dress on magazine covers, Loretta with a Bible in her hands, Loretta emerging from church on Sunday morning. The press called her the actress you can bring home to mother, the girl you marry, not sleep with. But there was a huge, terrible problem with this image. Loretta wasn't a saint. She was a human being with desires, curiosity, and normal instincts that the studio and religion taught her to suppress and be ashamed of. In the 1930s, good girls weren't allowed to want sex, show initiative, or have sexual curiosity. They had to wait for a man to take them, and then it wouldn't be their fault. By 22, Loretta had already been married and divorced, a short, catastrophic marriage to actor Grant Withers, an alcoholic and abuser that lasted less than a year. But MGM forced her to hide the divorce from the public because Catholics don't divorce, and you'll destroy your pure girl image. Loretta agreed to lie to the press, pretending the marriage had been annulled by the Catholic Church, when it was actually just a messy, ordinary divorce. This was her first big lie, but far from her last. She was learning that truth was less important than reputation, that image mattered more than reality, that lying was a survival tool in Hollywood. In 1935, she was legally free, but the public still thought she was virginal Saint Loretta Young, who had never touched a man. And that's when MGM gave her a role in The Call of the Wild with Clark Gable, filming on a remote location in the mountains of Washington, far from studio oversight, far from witnesses, far from protection. Her co-star, the King of Hollywood, a man who never heard the word no and didn't need to, because the studio covered everything he did. Question for the audience. Do you think MGM knew about Gable's reputation as a predator when they sent a 23-year-old holy girl to remote filming with him without protection? Or was this a deliberate choice? Throw the lamb to the wolf and see what happens. Write your opinion in the comments, because what we discover next suggests this was no accident. Gable the Predator, the king who took everything and paid for nothing. Clark Gable in 1935 wasn't just a star. He was a living god that millions of women across America masturbated to every night, imagining him taking them as roughly and dominantly as his on-screen lovers. Gone with the Wind hadn't hit theaters yet, but Gable was already Hollywood's biggest male star, the embodiment of masculinity, sex symbol #1. Women worshipped him, and Gable used that worship without mercy and without consequences. He was known on every film set in Hollywood as the one who takes the first night, with every new female co-star, not asking permission, not courting long, just taking what he wanted because he could. Joan Crawford, Jean Harlow, Carol Lombard, Virginia Gray, all slept with him. Some voluntarily, in love with the image he sold. Some because refusing Clark Gable meant career death, blacklisting, studio revenge. MGM knew about his behavior and actively covered every scandal, every pregnancy, every complaint. Gable had a contract that included a special clause for scandal protection. The studio paid women for silence, organized underground abortions for actresses he impregnated, bought the silence of cuckolded husbands, threatened journalists who tried to write the truth. Clark Gable was legally and socially untouchable, and he knew it perfectly. He behaved accordingly, like a man living in a world without consequences. In 1935, he was married to Rhea Langham, a woman 17 years his senior, a purely calculated marriage where she gave him society connections and respectability, and he gave her the status of being a star's wife. Rhea knew about the affairs, saw him with other women at parties, read about romances in the papers. She endured it because divorcing Clark Gable meant losing everything. When filming began on the Call of the Wild in the remote Washington mountains, Gable saw Loretta Young, a 23-year-old beauty with huge eyes and a virgin's reputation, the holy girl no one had ever touched, the only pure thing in dirty Hollywood. And he decided she would be his, because taking the untouched and dirtying it was his favorite entertainment. The crew watched him hunt. Gable invited Loretta for drinks after long workdays, paid her compliments that sounded like professional praise but carried sexual subtext, flirted in ways that made her feel special, chosen by the king of Hollywood himself. Loretta was dizzy with flattery. Clark Gable himself is paying attention to me. This can't be real. She didn't understand this wasn't courtship or romantic interest. This was grooming, systematic preparation of a victim, creating false trust before the attack. One night after a particularly grueling day of filming, Gable invited her to his trailer. Let's discuss tomorrow's scene. There's complex emotional dynamics between our characters. Loretta came alone, without escort, because refusing Clark Gable seemed unthinkable, because she'd been taught to be obedient to men with power, because she believed he genuinely wanted to discuss work. The trailer door closed behind her with a metallic click. What happened in the next minutes or hours, Loretta described 60 years later in one strange, passive sentence. He was available. Not we made love, not we had sex, not he seduced me. He was available, as if her body simply happened to be there, and he took advantage of that fact. Her daughter, hearing this phrasing years later, immediately recognized the truth. Mom, that's called rape. You use the passive voice because you can't admit that something was done to you against your will. Loretta broke down crying and said words that reveal the entire tragedy of the situation. Don't say that. I didn't resist. I didn't scream. I didn't run. Because you couldn't. You were alone in a locked trailer with the most powerful man in Hollywood. You thought refusing would kill your career, that he would destroy you if you said no. You were paralyzed by fear and awareness of the power imbalance. Loretta cried, but never agreed to call it rape. Until her dying day, she called it a romance, because admitting rape means admitting she was a victim, and a Catholic cannot be a victim of sex. She can only be a sinner who consented to sin. This is what religion does to victims. Turns them into defendants in their own crime. Pregnancy and disappearance. When consequences come for the woman, not the man. 3 months after that night in the trailer, when Loretta had already returned to Los Angeles trying to forget everything that happened, her period didn't come. Then didn't come again. She took a test, though she already knew the answer from the nausea that hit every morning. From the breast tenderness, from the instinctive dread growing inside along with the child. She was pregnant by Clark Gable in 1935, in an era when pregnancy outside marriage meant social death, career termination, and a lifetime brand as a whore. This was a death sentence for everything she'd built. Hollywood in 1935 forgave men absolutely everything. Affairs, violence, drinking, drugs, rape. But a woman pregnant outside marriage? Whore. Sinner. Garbage. Her name erased from all future projects, contracts torn up, doors slammed forever. Loretta called Gable with shaking hands, dialing his home number, hoping to hear even a drop of humanity, even a hint of responsibility. His response was cold, practical, and absolutely predictable. Get rid of it. Quickly. The studio will arrange it. They've done this 100 times. Abortion. Underground clinic. No questions, no consequences. For him. But Loretta was an Orthodox Catholic, raised in faith that abortion was mortal sin, a direct ticket to hell. Murder of an innocent soul for which there is no forgiveness. The church taught her it was better to die than have an abortion. Better to destroy your life than kill the fetus. She couldn't, even under threat of losing everything. Gable shrugged through the phone line. Then it's your problem, darling. I have nothing to do with this, and hung up. He never called her again, never asked about the child, never offered help. For him, this chapter closed the moment she refused the abortion. MGM offered a second solution: give birth secretly at a remote location, place the child in an orphanage without registering the mother, return to Hollywood after a few months under the pretense of illness. No one will ever know. Career saved, reputation intact. Loretta agreed because there was no other choice. In December 1935, when her belly began growing so much that clothing could no longer hide the pregnancy, she announced to the press she was taking extended leave for health reasons and traveling to Europe for treatment. In reality, she was hiding in a secret house in Los Angeles, where MGM rented her a room under a false name. The pregnancy proceeded in absolute solitude and terror. Gable didn't call. The studio sent money but not support. Family didn't know the truth. Loretta lied to them just as she lied to the press. She was alone with her growing belly and Catholic guilt that ate her from inside more viciously than the pregnancy. She spent nights in prayer, begging God to forgive her sin, though the sin wasn't hers. Religion had taught her that if something happened to her body, she was guilty, she consented, she must repent. November 6, 1935, in a small private clinic without windows, where the doctor was paid by the studio for silence, Loretta Young gave birth to a healthy girl after 18 hours of labor alone, without her mother nearby, without friends, without the child's father. She named the girl Judy Enye, the only decision she was allowed to make herself. 2 days after birth, when her body still bled and ached, when hormones raged and maternal instincts screamed to hold the baby, MGM took newborn Judy from her arms and drove her to an orphanage, registering her as Mother Unknown, Father Unknown. Loretta returned to Hollywood, smiled at premieres, gave interviews about her recovery in Europe, told fabricated stories about London and Paris. The press admired how well she looked after her illness. But at night, she cried until vomiting, imagining her daughter in a cold institutional crib among strangers, screaming from hunger, whom no one hugs. Catholic guilt tore her apart. Enye. She sinned, gave birth outside marriage, abandoned her own child. 3 mortal sins in one. After 19 months of psychological torture, Loretta could no longer bear thoughts of her daughter in the orphanage. She came to MGM with a demand. I want to adopt a child. Arrange it officially through an agency. The studio organized a fake adoption through a front agency. Loretta adopted her own daughter, whom she had given birth to, as if she were someone else's orphan. She paid money to adopt her own child. America applauded standing. What a kind, compassionate woman. Loretta Young adopted a poor orphan.
Hollywood's holy girl is holy even in her personal life. The press wrote rapturous articles about her charity. The church praised her Christian mercy. Fans sent letters saying, "You're my role model." No one knew that the orphan Judy was her own daughter, conceived through rape by Clark Gable. The lie was complete, and now Loretta had to live with it until the end of her days.
Question for the audience. Do you think Clark Gable ever saw his daughter in person? Did he ever meet Judy even once, knowing she was his child? Or did he completely ignore her existence as an inconvenient fact to be erased? Write your thoughts in the comments because the answer to this question is even more horrifying than you can imagine. Judy, the ghost child who should never have existed. Judy Lewis grew up in Loretta Young's beautiful Bel Air mansion, surrounded by luxury and privileges of Hollywood elite, but with a constant feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with her existence, that she didn't fit the picture, that her mother didn't love her the way she should. Outwardly, she looked very much like Loretta, the same dark hair, same large expressive eyes, same beautiful face. But there were the ears, huge, protruding, oddly shaped ears that didn't resemble any member of the Young family. Ears that were an exact genetic copy of Clark Gable's ears, his most recognizable physical feature, the one caricaturists exaggerated in drawings. Everyone in Hollywood who saw Judy immediately recognized those ears. At social parties, people whispered behind her back. Journalists noticed the resemblance but were afraid to write because accusing Clark Gable meant ending your career. Actors and directors saw the truth but stayed silent because Hollywood protected its kings at any cost. And Loretta was obsessed with her daughter's ears to the point of psychosis. She forced Judy to wear hats constantly, in summer, at home, on walks, for photo shoots. Even in Los Angeles heat, Judy had to go with her head covered. Loretta styled her hair to fall over her ears and hide them, used clips and headbands that pressed the ears to her head. At age 7, without explanation and without Judy's own consent, Loretta took her daughter to a plastic surgeon and had her undergo otoplasty, a painful operation to correct her ears.
A 7-year-old child woke up from anesthesia with bandages on her head and didn't understand what happened or why. Loretta only said, "Now you'll be prettier." Judy didn't understand why her mother was so obsessed with her ears, why this element of her appearance triggered such a painful reaction. But she understood that something was wrong with her, that she was defective, that her body was incorrect. But the ears weren't the biggest problem. Much worse was Loretta's emotional coldness as a mother. The distance, absence of warmth, inability to hug her daughter or speak words of love. Loretta never hugged Judy just because, never kissed her goodnight, never said "I love you, I'm proud of you, you're special." She raised her daughter formally, coldly, like a guardian performing duties rather than a mother loving a child. Judy grew up with a heavy, oppressive feeling. My mother doesn't love me. I'm adopted, so she doesn't feel toward me what real mothers feel. I'm not a real child. I'm a burden. And the truth was that Loretta couldn't love Judy because every time she looked at her daughter, she saw a living reminder of that night in the trailer. Saw Clark Gable, saw her sin, saw the lie she had to maintain every day. Judy wasn't a daughter. She was evidence of a crime that needed hiding. When Judy was 15, a schoolmate told her at lunch words that exploded her world. "You know Clark Gable is your real father, right? You have his ears. All the adults talk about it, but pretend not to notice." Judy laughed nervously. "What? That's crazy. I'm adopted. My biological parents are unknown." Look at photos of Gable from the 1930s. Look at your ears before surgery in old photos. It's identical. You're his copy. Judy came home trembling with shock and denial, pulled out old family albums and found her childhood photos before surgery. Then found photos of Clark Gable at the library. Laid them side by side. The ears, her ears, his ears. Absolutely identical.
She approached Loretta, holding both photos in her hands, and asked in a trembling voice, "Mom, is Clark Gable my biological father?" Loretta went so pale her lips turned white. She looked at the photos, then at her daughter, and lied directly to her face. "No, absolutely not. Don't say such foolishness. It's a coincidence." Judy didn't believe her, but there was no proof. DNA testing didn't exist. She lived with this question, this suspicion, this knowledge she couldn't prove for another 16 years. At 31, when Judy was already an adult married woman with her own child, she came to Loretta and said, "Mom, I'm 31 years old. I have a right to know the truth. Am I your biological daughter? Is Clark Gable my father? Tell me the truth right now, or I will never speak to you again." Loretta broke down sobbing the first time Judy had ever seen her mother cry. And finally, after 31 years of lies, she confessed. "Yes, you're my daughter. I gave birth to you. Clark Gable is your biological father. But you must never, ever, under any circumstances, tell anyone about this. Do you promise?" Judy asked directly, "Was it rape?" Loretta answered through tears, "No, we had an affair. We loved each other but couldn't be together." But her eyes, her trembling hands, her inability to say it in her real words, everything spoke of a different truth. Judy knew, but she promised to stay silent, and stayed silent for another 47 years. The truth emerges. 60 years later, when everyone's dead, Judy Lewis lived 76 years, and not a single day of them was truly free from the lie Loretta imposed on her at birth. She became an actress, though never achieved her mother's fame. Married a producer, had a son, tried to build a normal life. But the truth about her origins hung over every day like a sword of Damocles, a secret she couldn't tell, but that defined everything. Clark Gable died in 1960 of a heart attack at 59.
He lived his entire life knowing he had a daughter, and never once, not a single time, acknowledged her, spoke to her, gave her a cent of inheritance, didn't even send a birthday card. Judy was at his funeral among the crowd of grieving fans, stood in the back rows, and watched them bury her father, who had never acknowledged her as his. No one from Gable's family approached her. No one knew who she was. She was a ghost at her own father's funeral. In 1994, when Judy was 58, Loretta Young gave a major magazine interview where she publicly spoke for the first time about her romance with Clark Gable. But her version was carefully edited and cleaned of all uncomfortable details. Loretta said, "We had a beautiful romance during the Call of the Wild. We were in love but couldn't be together because of his marriage. It was a tragic love that remained in the past." No mention of pregnancy. No mention of a child. No mention of what really happened in that trailer. Only a romantic story about forbidden love between two stars. Judy read this interview and felt betrayed one last time. Even now, even 60 years later, her mother was rewriting history, turning rape into love, shame into romance, her existence into non-existence. Loretta Young died in 2000 at 87, surrounded by glory, awards, and public love. Until her dying day, she defended Clark Gable's reputation and called him the love of her life. A year after her death,
When the vow of silence was finally lifted, Judy Lewis wrote a memoir titled Uncommon Knowledge, 2001. In this book, she told the whole truth, every detail Loretta had forced her to hide. How her mother hid during pregnancy and gave birth to her in a secret clinic. How she was placed in an orphanage as Mother Unknown. How Loretta adopted her own child and pretended she was rescuing an orphan. How she was obsessed with Judy's ears and had her undergo plastic surgery at 7.
How Clark Gable knew about her existence and completely ignored her all his life. How Catholic guilt turned Loretta into a cold, emotionally unavailable mother. How it took Judy 31 years to learn the truth about herself. And most importantly, how Judy finally understood and named what happened in that trailer in 1935. It was rape, not romance. It was using power and fear to obtain sex, not mutual attraction. Hollywood reacted to the book predictably, with silence. Major media didn't review it. TV shows didn't invite Judy for interviews. Studios acted as if the book didn't exist. The legend of King of Hollywood, Clark Gable, was too important to let truth destroy it. Gone with the Wind brought in millions of dollars every year. Merchandise, licenses, re-releases, everything built on Gable's image as a romantic hero. Admitting that Rhett Butler was played by a rapist meant losing money. So Hollywood chose silence. And most people never heard Judy's story. Judy Lewis died in 2011 at 76 from cancer. At her funeral, there wasn't a single representative from the Gable family. Her half-sister on her father's side, Clark Gable's daughter by another woman, refused to acknowledge her existence until death. Judy was buried as daughter of Loretta Young, not as daughter of Clark Gable, because even in death, truth was less important than protecting the legend. The legacy of lies and the price of silence. The story of Loretta Young, Clark Gable, and Judy Lewis isn't just a story about one rape and one family secret. This is a systemic problem of Hollywood, religion, and culture that repeats again and again with different names and faces, but always with the same result. Man takes, woman bears consequences. Truth gets buried. This is a story about how religion turns victims into accomplices in their own violence. Loretta couldn't call it rape because the Catholic Church taught her that if you had sex, regardless of whether voluntary or not, you sinned. The Church doesn't distinguish between violence and consent, only extramarital sex, which is always sin. So Loretta chose to believe she sinned rather than that she was raped, because sin can be redeemed through prayers, while rape makes you a victim, and being a victim is shameful. This is a story about how Hollywood protects predators because they make money while victims are expendable. MGM knew about Gable's behavior, knew he raped actresses on film sets, impregnated them, and abandoned them. The studio had an entire department specializing in solving Gable problems, paying for abortions, buying silence, threatening witnesses. This wasn't a secret. This was part of the business model. This is a story about how children become living evidence of crimes that need hiding. Judy Lewis spent her whole life feeling unwanted, that her existence was wrong, that her mother didn't love her. And she was right. Loretta couldn't love a living reminder of her sin, couldn't embrace proof of her lie. And this is a story about how legends matter more than truth, how image matters more than reality, how dead rapists are protected by living victims. Clark Gable is still considered an icon. Gone with the Wind plays every Christmas,
Tourists photograph themselves at his star on the Walk of Fame. No one talks about how Rhett Butler was played by a man who raped his colleagues and abandoned his children. Loretta Young is still remembered as Hollywood's holy girl, a pious Catholic who adopted an orphan and raised her as her own. No one talks about how she abandoned her own child, then bought her back, and forced her to keep the secret for 31 years. And Judy Lewis died never receiving the acknowledgement she deserved. Acknowledgement that her mother was a victim, that her father was a rapist, that her existence wasn't shame, but was the consequence of a crime for which no one ever answered.
How many more children of Hollywood grew up not knowing who their real parents are? How many adopted children of stars are actually biological children born from rapes and hidden for careers? How many golden age romances were actually violence, renamed to preserve legends? Judy Lewis wrote in her book one sentence that reveals the entire tragedy. "I don't blame my mother for what she did. She was a victim of a system that left her no choice." But here's the thing. Loretta Young lived until 2000. She saw the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s. She saw women begin telling the truth about violence. She saw a culture that slowly, painfully began believing victims instead of blaming them. And even then, even with these changes around her, Loretta chose to protect Clark Gable, chose to call rape a romance, chose to force her daughter into silence to preserve the legend of a dead rapist. Because in the end, protecting the image was more important than freeing her daughter. That's what Hollywood is. That's what the Golden Age was. That's the real price of fame.